Thank you for coming this morning. You know, I don't thank you often enough, I think, for your graciousness in having me here every month to pontificate as I will, and you're so nice to me. I try to offer something of value every time I speak, but I am just one person living one life, and when I project from my experience, it's necessarily limited. But the nice thing about having a congregational experience is I get feedback, and so I learn from you as well. This morning I'm going to talk about a big idea, economics, particularly about the inequality of wealth distribution in our country and the world. And, you know, making a living is what we do with most of our waking hours. And what we make, how we make it, and what we do with who gets to benefit from what we make. All these have ethical consequences. Jesus spoke much more about money than he did about sex, and I'd point out that he wasn't angry at the woman at the well, but he threw a real tantrum at the money changers in the temple. Now, my perspective on economics is a little unconventional for a Unitarian, because of my background, which I'll explain. So on a topic this big, you're bound to say, yes, but, well, what about this? And of course, in 20 minutes, I just can't cover all of those things. But I believe what I'm going to present will make you think, and together we might hope to build some consensus about how Unitarian-Universalists might bend the world around us to a more just, prosperous, and fulfilling one. It's November 1974 in the country north of Jonesboro, Arkansas. I'm living with 5 other musicians in a single-story frame house up on blocks at the edge of a rice field with no insulation in the walls or ceiling. A train track goes across our driveway. Every time a train goes by, it shakes the whole house. The rent is only $50 per month, but it's cold, and we found that the single propane space heater and the gas stove we cook on consume at least another $50 worth of gas a month. The energy crisis had just started. We found big sheets of cardboard and we stapled them to the joists in the attic, hoping to keep some of the precious heat in. We've bought a 50-pound sack of brown rice from the Riceland Rice Factory and eat rice with ketchup, rice with beans, rice with a little chicken sometimes, and are pursuing a rock and roll dream. The drummer of the band shows up one night with a steak and some sardines he shoplifted from the Piggly Wiggly. The flute player can't afford to contribute to the meals because one of the tires in his old car blew out last week, and he had to spend all his savings to buy a new tire so he could get to his part-time job, which he won't get paid for until the end of the week. When you're poor, one thing leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. Your car breaks down, you can't get to work. When you can't get to work, you don't have the money to fix your car. You have no savings, so sometimes you pay the minimum on your credit cards, which of course means you pay hundreds of dollars a year in interest charges and maybe late fees and penalties. When you're on the bottom of this economy, if you stumble, the game is rigged to kick you all the way down the stairs. Change of scene. It's May 1985. My company has sent me to a convention in Las Vegas, Nevada. I have a large room at Caesar's Palace with a big circular tub in the bedroom. I'm sleeping in a big round bed with mirrors on the ceiling. A large fruit basket sits on the table, compliments of a company that wants to do business with my company. I go down to the lobby to meet my coworkers. We get into a large stretch limousine that takes us to a steak and lobster joint at the other end of the strip. After the convention is over, another limo takes me to the airport. I get seated in first class. While the plane is still sitting on the runway, the stewardess pours me my first glass of champagne. Bessie Smith once said, "I've been rich and I've been poor. Being rich is better." Now ask yourself, what was different about me in those 2 periods of my life, rich Dan and poor Dan? Why did I deserve a great hotel room and free food at one point, and a cold, uninsulated bedroom and boiled rice at another? Had I gained some great skill? Had I produced something of value in the meantime? The answer in my case illustrates a basic truth that gets ignored in the economic discussions. There really wasn't much difference. I was the same person. I had pretty much the same skills and knowledge, the same personality, the same mind. Some of my abilities had advanced, but others had waned. The idea that poor people are poor because they lack something or don't work hard enough, or that rich people have some special, unique gift that entitles them to a larger and larger share of the pie, it just doesn't ring true to me. Our system over-rewards some, and it over-penalizes others. I'd like to change that for the good of everybody. A rising tide, it is said, lifts all boats. This doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. We don't need to steal from the rich to give to the poor. I don't know if you remember that Monty Python sketch where Robin Hood is taking from the rich and eventually the rich are poor, and my, this redistribution of wealth is so difficult. Nor do I want to rehash the Cold War between communism and capitalism. As always, the pundits, the generals, are fighting the last war instead of the next one. Our choices are not between a discredited system and an inadequate one. We need to use science and logic to build a fair one. Well, when you're in those first-class seats, it's easy to forget how the other 99% live. On the upper deck of a 747, you don't even have to walk down the same aisle as the people in business class or coach. On the other hand, when you're traveling in economy class, which is like steerage in comparison, it's easy to fantasize about how easy it must be for those folks in the front of the plane. Now, the classic symbol of the divide between the aristocrats and the peons is a phrase falsely attributed to Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France before the Revolution. When she was told that Parisians were rioting because there was no bread, she supposedly replied, "Well, let them eat cake." As if there was so much cake in her life, there must be enough for everyone. Let them eat cake. That's a phrase that embodies the way a lot of us feel about today's aristocracy, we call the 1%. They just don't get it. Off with their heads. Now, the truth is more nuanced. Marie Antoinette never said that, it turns out. It was invented propaganda. She had shown some compassion for the poor, but she was resented because she was not born in France. When I was in corporate life, I didn't see anyone lounging by the pool waiting for the dividend check to come in. They did have pools and yachts, but they didn't usually have time to use them. When they were out of touch, it was because they were so focused on their own business, they didn't have time to see the bigger picture of our society. They were workaholics. Now, I grew up in the suburb next to Kenilworth, Illinois, which is the richest suburb per capita in the United States. And I went to a great public high school supported lavishly by their real estate taxes. The fathers of my friends in Kenilworth and the presidents of the companies I later worked for focused on their jobs to the exclusion of their families, their spiritual life, and the things they actually enjoyed doing. They were stressed out. They had lots of money, but they rarely enjoyed it. Several I know died early from heart attacks, partially because they smoked like chimneys, but others lost their fortunes when they didn't know to call it quits. Once you have a certain amount of wealth, is there an incremental benefit to getting more and more, of spending your life chasing the golden ring? Well, studies say there isn't. The Harvard psychologist Daniel Gilbert said that once you get to an annual income of between $50,000 and $75,000, the effect of more and more money on your life satisfaction tapers off pretty quickly. Okay, so rich people work hard for a living, most of them, and they have their own problems. What about the idea that they're so good at what they do, they need to have more resources to make the economy stronger? You know, the idea that we need to keep shoveling money upwards to the job creators because they have personal gifts that the rest of us don't have. Well, as I said in my rich man, poor man situation, it didn't work with my experience. I saw that the people who own the companies aren't necessarily smarter than the people that work for them. They may have had an insight at one point that allowed them to get a jump on the market. But later, their ideas were as likely to be as wrong as anybody else's. They were in the right place at the right time. They found the right people to help them. And they had a certain amount of aggressiveness. Those were the main factors to corporate success I saw. When you read the biography of Steve Jobs, who was arguably the greatest wealth creator of our era, you see that money wasn't a motivation for him. He never got the big mansion with the gate around it, even though some of his employees did. He was into creating insanely great products, the iPhone, the iPad, the Macintosh, for their own sake. And I saw many times that inventors, the people who really created, I think of the spreadsheet, I think of the graphical user interface, the people actually did that, didn't make a lot of money in the end. Well, so I've been rich, I've been poor, and I have no illusions about either. Neither should you. I've been in the shack by the tracks and in the boardroom making financial projections for a $100 million company. Although I have to admit, my poverty when it was there wasn't nearly as hopeless as the people who were born into real poverty. As it turned out, when things got too bad in Arkansas, I was able to go back to my mother's nice, warm suburban house north of Chicago with its nicely stocked kitchen and refrigerator and enough money to pay the bills. Eventually, my diploma from a Big Ten university greased my way to becoming a corporate executive in the electronics industry, so I was one of those 10 people making decisions about what products we'd make, where we'd make them, and how much they'd cost. So my life experience doesn't allow me to believe the stereotypes, of rich and poor that get offered. The idea that, our media is corporate media. It's not liberal media or conservative media. It's essentially a megaphone for the wealthy and powerful people of both stripes. And its biggest blind spot is there. At worst, it's clueless about the way the majority of people live. Conservatives are biased against government policy, despite clear historical evidence that government action can improve the economy of their country if the government's smart about it. Now, I'm not going to waste your time talking about the errors of trickle-down economics, let's say. You already know that stuff. That's a dead horse. Tom Hartman and Rachel Maddow beat that horse for a living, and I refer you to them. What I think, and I'm going to be a little risky here, what I think you need to hear is a little skepticism about the progressive and liberal biases that sometimes we exhibit. Ignorance about the stock market, the bond market, and what corporations control and what corporations don't run rampant. Just as conservatives are biased about government, sometimes the left is biased about corporations. Now, I've attended scary seminars at General Assembly, and we've had them here, that present information saying that corporate structures are inherently sociopathic. Companies have to be exploitative to be successful. But there is clear historical evidence that the work most corporations do supports life, not only the life of their overly paid executives, but the lives of their employees, shareholders, and customers. Most companies work in good faith and will do the right thing when they're not pressured to do otherwise. My point really is that biased information from either right or left keeps us from moving forward to a better world. Both sides want a prosperous economy. They just have different ideas about how to get there. But neither of them has been testing their ideas against science necessarily. And I think our religious principles can help us move the debate into a more productive path. And that's my goal this morning, to display a bigger picture and move beyond the propaganda. The real factor that makes one economy better than another is not its ratio of socialism versus capitalism, or government regulation versus a free market, or even, I'll go on a limb, the ratio of rich versus poor. It's the ratio of empathy to uncaring, and the proportion of honesty versus corruption. A government, a corporation, is only as moral and ethical as the people who are in it. When they're staffed with honest people who keep the welfare of everyone in mind, they can do great things. But if they have no regard for how what they do affects other people, a downward spiral begins. Now, let's talk about distortions here. Demagogues of both sides sometimes will take a moral failing of someone and claim this is an example of how the whole system should be thrown out. And usually these are what you call outliers, extremes of the data set. You find something that's not typical, but it makes you so angry, it gets you all riled up. Let me give you an example. Right-wing talking points usually, feature a food stamp recipient who abuses the program. Food stamps have created a culture of dependency. Once you're on it, you're hooked. And this is the surfer dude who Fox News went out and he's in a rock band and he's taking food stamps so he can surf all day and practice all night, and he's eating lobster with his food stamps. Should we get rid of the entire supplemental nutrition program because of Surfer Dude? Well, you know, the truth about SNAP benefits is once you're on it, you don't stay on it. The average time receiving benefits is 8 to 10 months. And 83% of the people who are on supplemental nutrition program the families have a child, a senior or disabled member. And the other thing is that these benefits don't only help the person who's receiving them, they help the entire community that person lives in. They create $1.70 of value. And, you know, these huge benefits. Surfer Dude was getting like $112 a month, compared to all the other things we spend money on, you know. Let's look at the other outlier in the debate. Let's talk about the people who abuse the corporate system. You remember these guys. Enron Corporation defrauded its shareholders of $74 billion. That's enough to pay for the entire food stamp program for a year. Scale, you know? And there were, should we get rid of the entire New York Stock Exchange because of Enron, which was followed by these guys, Global Crossing and WorldCom, all these things, and in 2008 by Lehman Brothers? I don't see Fox News advocate for that, oddly. When looking at corporate malfeasance, there's clearly sophisticated enough to understand that a few bad apples don't spoil the whole barrel, and in that sense, I don't blame them. There are over 7 million companies in our country that have a payroll. Thousands of those are publicly traded as stocks. And how many of them are like these companies? Not even 10%. But if I were a left-wing ideologue, I would be here arguing that all of them are. The pursuit of profit has, with no regard for the effect on other people, is written into the corporate charter. The executive's first and only duty is to shareholders. Therefore, there's a systemic incentive for companies to exploit their workers, pollute the environment, and bend the laws wherever possible. Now, on paper and in theory, I think this is an important concept. I don't dismiss it. It deserves a place in our awareness. But I spent years in corporate life. We should be so dedicated to be able to do what the shareholders want us to do. We'd be lucky enough to be able to figure out how to get out of our own way. I sat at the big table with the president at the top and 9 or 10 other people in with the flow charts and the whiteboards and the reams of computer printouts trying to figure out what we were supposed to do. Mostly, we talked a lot. We talked in meetings, over dinner, one-on-one, in email, over the phone. And I will shock you right now by agreeing with Mitt Romney, who said, "Corporations are people, my friend." No, I don't agree that corporations as entities should have the rights of human beings to donate to political campaigns. I don't believe in corporate personhood that way. What I think he was saying is that corporations are made up of people, for good and bad. When we look at corporations as if they're not made up, just another way of organizing people, just like governments are, we handicap and catastrophize our thinking. In the end, a corporation does only what the people in it do. Management is not all-powerful. The opinions of your employees, your customers, and the general public are always somewhere in the minds of a sane and effective manager. But you could say the same thing to conservatives. Governments are made of people too. When a government official abuses the public trust, it no more proves that governments are inherently inefficient than Enron proved that all corporations are inherently corrupt. Corrupt people are what make corrupt institutions. There's nothing about one kind of organization or another that makes people inherently lazy or predatory. But in both places can be hijacked by sociopaths that get in control and ruin what other good people in that organization want to do. We need to move the debate away from its focus on what kind of institution should be dominant and focus instead on increasing the morality and the empathy of the people in the system. Capitalism has succeeded because our society has religious ethics at its core. You take away that cultural belief in the inherent worth and dignity of all people, and capitalism will become a destructive monster. Let's go ahead here. This is the thing we're talking about, really. Our ancestors came to the United States to be free of an aristocracy so they could have their own land instead of being peasants and tenant farmers. Yet now all the statistics show that the United States has devolved back into a kind of aristocracy with a huge share of income and wealth in the hands of very few people. This isn't new to most of you, but it bears repeating. This is from Dr. Domhoff of the University of California. And what this basically is showing, the gray bar is the top 20%. And that's how much of the total wealth they own. And this adds up to, the top 20% own 89% of the wealth of the assets. And of that, the top 1% own more than a third of all the wealth. That leaves only 11% for everybody else, the other 4/5 of the people. Now, that's pretty scary. It also leads to a class warfare model. Let's resent the greedy rich people. But there is another way of looking at this polarity. There was a great spiritual teacher from the East visiting the U.S. A bunch of his followers sat at his feet to hear his message. The yogi asked if there were any questions, and a person in the audience asked him if he thought the U.S. was a sinful country because we had this great inequality of wealth. The yogi replied, "On the contrary, I think this is a great country. Only 1% of you are silly enough to keep chasing after material things after you've already had enough." We could look at it that way. But economists do tell us that less total wealth is being created. People are made poorer by the concentration of wealth in so few hands. And if our goal is a world where extreme poverty is eliminated, this is one of the problems that stands in our way. And I'll conclude this fragment of my economic spiel by talking about overcapitalization and undercapitalization, because these are the two streams. Basically, one of the things you can't read in the fine print here is that the bottom 20% don't even show up on the graph. The middle thing is what people think the distribution is. The bottom one is what most economists think the ideal distribution should be. So we're way off. Overcapitalized. More than you know what to do with. When we set up the rules to allow resources in the end, money comes down to water, land, materials. If those get hoarded in the hands of a few, that top 1% is overcapitalized. And common sense tells us that you can only have so much stuff before you can't take very good care of what you have. You can only live in so many houses at one time. At a certain point, your home in Vail or your cabin in Maine or your penthouse in Manhattan is going to be neglected. Remember Bernie Madoff? Now, Madoff was able to pull off his Ponzi scheme because a lot of very rich people handed all their money to him because they couldn't manage it themselves. They literally had more than they could spend or invest. And Madoff was happy to spend it, waste it actually for them. Now, experienced investors, let's see what we got here. Experienced investors know what happens to a successful mutual fund. When there's a hot new mutual fund, lots of money goes into it, and the fund gets bigger and bigger, and the managers can't make the kind of daring stock market moves they made when the fund was small, because their own actions will affect the market. They're no longer nimble. They have too much money to manage. Some of the mergers on Wall Street are because your company has so much cash from being profitable, and you decide not to spend it on dividends, which is what the original model was, to redistribute the wealth to the investors. So they buy another company. Apple has $160 billion in cash on top of their other assets, and they paid no dividends until, I think, 3 years ago. Verizon has $54 billion in the bank, and that should tell you that if they really wanted to get high-speed internet all through West County, they could do it without government help. Comcast used $18 billion of its money to buy NBC Universal, and history of corporate mergers, anybody who's been in the stock market for a while knows, 80% of the corporate mergers don't work to the benefit of the shareholders. The two companies before, when they merge, wind up being worth about the same. It's not like you're creating wealth by merging these companies. When you're overcapitalized, it's hard to know what to focus on as a businessman. Now, the other side is the undercapitalized. And of course, when I rock band in Arkansas, we were classically undercapitalized. We needed a PA system. We didn't have one. We had to borrow one. We didn't have a van to take us on tour. We were talented. People liked our music. We didn't have the resources to make that thing fly. And there were plenty of families and small businesses in this country who could make value, who could create wealth, but they don't have the tools. I'm talking here about real capital, not the paper kind. You just waste time because you don't have the right tool for the job. There was a story in the news about a woman who was arrested for leaving her 2-year-old son in the car. Turned out she didn't have money to pay for childcare, and she was going for a job interview. Her undercapitalization leads to inefficiency. Inefficiency is a word that even the wealthy people can understand. I hope. Now, the other problem of being undercapitalized is the undercutting tomorrow to deal with today's problems. You don't have $40 to change the oil today, and later on, if you don't ever change your oil, you have to replace the engine for $4,000. The poor get steered into choices that make them poorer. The cheapest food you can buy is at McDonald's. If that leads to empty calories, obesity, and diabetes and high medical bills that wind up on Medicaid. There's the teenager who drops out of school to make money today, robbing his future to get through the present. And the least understood aspect of undercapitalization is its emotional side. People ask, why don't they pick themselves up by their bootstraps? Well, after years of doing the work you hate, that doesn't feed your soul, that isn't interesting, work that hurts your feet and arms with no options to do anything else, you just get tired. You can't be expected to have the enthusiasm or optimism of a person who has the money to take a vacation when they're a little burned out. Well, to conclude, what made the U.S. the largest economy in the world isn't the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. It was the widespread diffusion of wealth to many people that unleashed our productive capacity. Now that we're back to an unequal distribution of wealth, growth is slowing. No surprise. That's the block to growth. That's obviously unfair to the have and have-nots, but it also cuts the potential for the haves. It's rooted in a false puritanical social Darwinism that a tough environment is somehow good for our character. The economy exemplifies the many ways that we're all interconnected. Rich and poor, worker and manager, government and corporation. My spending is your income. Your saving is my borrowing. A good business won't last in the long run by impoverishing its customers. We UUs have pledged to affirm and promote the interdependent web that binds us all together and the worth and dignity of all people. Economic fairness is a fundamental issue that challenges our society. The old paradigms of capitalism and communism have failed us. We need to move beyond those stereotypes and old ideas, the stereotypes of rich versus poor, lazy versus hardworking, if we're going to build the world that we dream of. May it be so.